Chapter 10. Pain bursts my eyeballs, pink and amber, and the ache isn't falling. It's turned inside out like I'm tied to it, deep inside bones and guts, and feel my teeth waggling loose. I can't spit them out. I can't find the saliva dry, whole body bleached away. Voices whisper about me, around me, where I've been and who I don't have ears any more to hear them. My whole head sanded smooth, a billiard ball. The wind has gnawed through me. Pain to stop it, the brightness of the light bright. To take away my eyes again, remember no memory, only feeling, and I laugh, though I can't laugh. And Barbara's hand is tight around my own, but I can't touch her, can't feel her there, just know she hangs on to me, and there's no separation when we're all one, commingled, and the ship, it haunts my senses, bleeding into one another. I taste blood and noise, and we all fall upwards into the never getting nearer gloom. I once got lost in a smog like this. Clarity voice quiet, and not me, and rushing by me. Funny, he's funny, and I know it. It was when we were living in Coal Hill, and my work had kept me out later than I'd meant. Coal Hill, a schoolroom and test tubes and chalk and wide-eyed teens. A great blanket of grey came down out of nowhere. I couldn't even see the end of my pipe. What do you think of that, The doctor telling a story. I can see it too, the smog. I can feel it. The smog is holding me together. And do you know what I did to find my way home? I counted the steps. I should say I counted my way all across London, 1 foot then the next. Yes, count the steps, find your way home out of the murk. 1 step, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I can think again. I can feel myself coming back together. 8, 9, the doctor's voice. I can fix on it. 10, 11, 12. Barbara's hand is clenched around mine. 13, 14. He's got us through this. 15, 16. He's got us through. They were whole again. Barbara stood in jelly-legged amazement, eyes and extremities almost shrieking with relief. She could see. She could breathe. Ian grinned at her, his hair ruffled. She felt sick deep inside, with a horrible bristling dryness at the back of her throat. Phantom visions played across her mind, of the others falling and melting and screaming around her, of Andrew's and 100 other faces too, shrieking their lungs out and making no sound, frozen in that ghastly instant. The doctor's voice had pulled her back from the abyss. Without him, they might all have been lost, their insides and outsides mixed up by an all-pervading monstrous lodestone. A lodestone, she realized now, that had looked like a police box. They all stood where they were, Ian, herself, the doctor, Susan, and Griffiths. They still held hands, just breathing, feeling real again. Barbara could have stood like that forever. A glorious cold drizzle whispered against her skin. West India Quay was brown, the water sloshing thickly in the dock speckled over with mouldering leaves. Beneath the surface loomed dark industrial shapes. Girders, machinery, cranes given up to the depths like a sacrifice to old gods. The curbstones around the quay were chipped and uncared for. The broken windows of the warehouses all round them reflected the autumn. It was cold. Even the air was full of decay, stagnation. Barbara let Ian's hand go reluctantly. They stood in the drizzle and took in the new world, a mockery of the Canary Wharf they had known. The pristine skyscrapers had been replaced with squat, square, red-brick follies, gutted and blackened by fire. There was no monorail, no underground station, no aluminium or toughened glass. "It's so different," said Susan. "We know that 34 years have yet to pass," mused the doctor. He wheeled round, shaking a finger at one building after another. "I should say, though, that this could be prime real estate. It would appear that way to anyone if they only applied their minds. Yes, I can see gleaming spires sprouting up all round us one day." Susan laughed along with him. Barbara knew what the old man was up to. He was often at his best when he downplayed the dangers that faced them. This run-down place promised to be as intimidating as the year they'd just left. They'd have to be cautious, to learn its rules. "There are people," said Griffiths. Dirty faces and beady eyes peered at them from behind broken glass and from shadows. Yet, Barbara thought, they were not the threat Griffith's tone implied. They were furtive, these half-glimpsed people. They were more like prey than predator. "I suppose they're used to people appearing out of thin air," said the doctor. "Even so, we should keep out of the open," said Ian, practical as ever. "At least until we can establish what's what," agreed the doctor. "We still need an eye on this bit of the key, though," said Griffiths. "We want to be here when Bamford turns up." They made their way to the nearest of the buildings, waiting while Griffiths ventured inside. He had not brought a gun with him, and as she listened for his return, Barbara found herself furious. He should have been armed. He had a duty to protect them. They heard nothing. Eventually, when anxiety had nearly eaten them all up, Griffiths appeared again. "I think we're all right," he said. "Is it safe?" Susan squealed, far louder than Barbara would have liked. They couldn't afford to draw attention to themselves. Griffiths winked at the girl. "It's not 5-star, but come see for yourself." The place stank, making Barbara's nostrils flare. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the gloom. The building might once have been offices, the ground floor made up of small partitions that she guessed would have been too constrictive for storing cargo. Pale, skinny bodies cowered in corners, peering out from under their dirty blankets. They were unwashed, undernourished, and she couldn't guess how long they'd been living like this. It was hardly a life. It was just existing. In one cubicle, she saw a woman sat perfectly still, propped against a wall. She was covered by what at first looked like a ragged fur blanket. The blanket undulated, coalesced. Barbara realized the woman had died recently, her corpse now ensconced in rats. "We can't stay here," she said. "We need shelter," said Griffiths, not turning back. "We need to be out of the open." He led them further inside, past more and more grotesque inhabitants. They made their way to the foot of a staircase, the steps uneven when they weren't missing altogether. "No one's upstairs," he said. "It's not safe," said the doctor. "It hardly looks structurally sound." "The damage is mostly cosmetic," said Griffiths. "Trust me, this place was built to last." "I admire your optimism, young man, I do. But this won't do for us. Come see the room first." Griffiths took the stairs carefully, probing each step with his toe before committing to it. The doctor swapped looks with Barbara and the others, but it was clear they had little other choice. Barbara followed the old man upstairs. The mould and stink were no different on the landing, but there were no people to be seen. Droplets tick-tocked through the smattering of roof. The floor underneath them was slick with foul water. "We can't camp down in the wet," said Ian. Griffiths ignored him, following the passageway round the stairwell, the corridor leading them back over the top of the way they'd just come. As they followed him, Barbara's senses were overcome by the dreary stench of damp. They emerged into a large room at the end of the passageway. A bomb must have hit it, shattering the thin dividing walls, opening the space out. The far wall had been ruptured, letting them look out onto the quay. The roof had fallen in, too, the rubble strewn about the middle of the room. Griffiths made his way over to a corner, disappearing into the shadows. "It's dry here," he said from the midst of the darkness, "and there's room for all of us." "Yes," said Ian, hurrying over to investigate. "We could make something of this. We can be safe here, and we can keep an eye on the quayside." "A fire in the middle of the room won't do any damage," said the doctor, also getting into the spirit. "We'll need to keep warm tonight." "We need to know the date, to know how long we'll be here," said Barbara. She wasn't convinced by the room, whatever the men seemed to see in it. "And food," said Susan. "I could do with some food." They divided up the tasks. Barbara would go with Griffiths to investigate food. In Ian's jacket pocket was the envelope of money they'd found on the dead Colonel Andrews all that time ago. In convenient, small denominations, there was nearly £100. Griffiths counted out half and gave the rest back to Ian. While he and Barbara were gone, the others would settle in, clear the space for the fire, and gather materials they could burn. Barbara could see that both Ian and Susan were unhappy, that she was the one going with Griffiths. Susan was envious, wanting his attention for herself. Ian wasn't worried about Griffiths. "Be careful," he said, taking Barbara's hand. "And you," she said. "We'll be an hour," Griffiths told them. "I don't have a watch," said Ian. "It's easy," Susan beamed at him. "I could tell you when an hour's gone by." "Yes, Susan, I believe you can," he said. "OK, be off with you both. The sooner you're gone, the sooner we're all together again." Barbara followed Griffiths back along the passageway. The stairs were harder to manage on the way down, and Barbara thought she might fall at any moment. The man exuded such an air of authority, of ability, that she hated the thought that the Griffiths might see her stumble. They hurried out of the building, Barbara never glancing at their fellow tenants. Outside, the drizzle continued. Griffiths scanned all round. "Which way do you think, then?" He made it sound casual. She liked that he thought to consult her. "South will take us to the river," she replied. "It's where you'd go to trade." "Good plan." They wove their way between the ruined buildings, Griffiths ever watchful. Again, people peeped out at them, but they were never challenged. Griffiths stayed alert, but Barbara felt herself relax. She stopped paying attention to the wreckage around them. Traipsing behind Griffiths, she thought of the London she had once known. How different it had been, how busy and bustling. How fragile, too, that madcap pace had been, if this ruination waited just a decade later. "We can talk if you like," said Griffiths, as if sensing her disquiet. "Yes, I'd like that," she said. "Tell me something useful. You studied this period, I suppose?" "Oh, yes," Griffiths smiled. "You're a historian, aren't you?" She laughed at that, knowing he was teasing her. "Hardly. It's funny, though. I'd have been retiring when you were starting school." "It gets worse, I'm afraid. If this is 1972, I've not been born yet." Barbara shook her head. "It's so strange," she said. "We've been travelling with the doctor for such a long time, but I still can't get used to it." "You want to know what the state of the world is now?" "Please." "Well, I wasn't always the most attentive pupil, and the records from this time are patchy. So, in broad brushstrokes, there are various groups trying to take charge now the machine has been beaten. There's no contact with other countries. In fact, each city pretty much fends for itself. In London, this is the time of would-be leaders, bumping each other off, each candidate coming up with harsher and harsher policies. Abby said people were rounded up in camps." She felt something in her stomach tighten just at the thought of it. "It's not happened yet, I don't think. Minorities are targets for abuse right now, but there's no one to organise anything on that scale for some years to come." He looked wistful. "Byng Street will all be just fields." Barbara smiled. "We must be able to." A man suddenly lunged out from a doorway at her, eyes bloodshot and raving. A woman was close behind him, crazy and screaming. Barbara had no time to cry out or fall back. The man's ravaged fingers grabbed for her face. The man suddenly dropped to his knees, the anger in his eyes flicking to amazement. Griffiths was stood right behind him. Quickly, without effort, he slipped his hand round under the man's jaw and cracked his head to one side. The man keeled over, dead. Barbara gazed in horror at the body. For all his savage looks and wild beard and hair, the man still wore the tatters of a lab coat. Griffiths had killed the woman too, and Barbara hadn't even noticed. The corpse lay face down in the doorway. "Poor wretches," said Griffiths. "Come on, we shouldn't linger." He took Barbara by the arm and led her quickly onwards. As her senses returned to her, Barbara was aware of other people muttering and hurrying on their way. The dead couple, she realised, might have had friends. They emerged from between buildings into an open space fronting the river. A mass of people swarmed around boats drawn up on the shore, jostling each other to get to the produce on offer. It looked like the market had been going on all day. The stalls were nearly empty, and what they did have looked of poor quality. Or perhaps that was the best this miserable time could do. "We're not going to get much of a bargain here," she said. Griffiths watched the crowd like a hunter regarding his prey. She was glad to be on his side. "We've no choice but to try, though," he said. "Let's get on with it." When Ian got back to the room, the doctor and Susan had got the fire going. Flames licked around the edges of the wood they'd stacked, smouldering grey smoke curling up into the exposed sky. The fire hissed and sizzled, sparking where the drizzle touched it. Susan and the doctor were lit up in gold, and their shabby room was transformed into a cosy bolt hole. Outside, darkness had fallen. They had left 2006 in the morning, but they'd arrived here in the late afternoon. It had already been too long a day. Ian dumped the bric-a-brac of wood he'd found, clattering it on top of the pile they'd built beside the fire. Finding broken-off bits of wood had been easy without having to go far, but finding wood that was still dry had been more of a challenge. "That should keep us going through the night," he said, dog-tired. He could see nowhere to clean his dirty hands. Not wanting to venture out of doors again just yet, he plumped down beside the others. The warmth reached into his body, was rough against his face. "There's been no word from the others," said the doctor gravely. "It's been 53 minutes, added Susan. Ian regarded the fire. "We don't know which way they'll have gone," he said. "We'd be chasing our own tails if we started after them now. Give them the full hour. Griffiths knows what he's doing." "I'm sure you're right," said the doctor, though he didn't sound convinced. "I hope they have found us something to eat," agreed Susan. "I'm starving." "Gruel and potatoes, do you?" Griffiths marched cheerily into the room, hugging a cardboard box stuffed with provisions. Barbara hurried after him, wielding a frying pan. "We managed to find the market." Susan leapt to her feet, running over to investigate what they had found. Ian watched her, amazed by her reserves of energy. He was ready to drop. The girl took the box from Griffiths and began removing each item, lining them up on the floor. There were some small, muddy potatoes, some tins, some poultry greens, all very basic fare. "Is this it?" she said. "Did you spend all the money?" "We found some plates and cutlery too, Susan," Barbara explained. She looked like Ian felt, worn out. Strands had come loose from her high sweep of hair. There was an endearing smudge of dirt on her nose. "What was the market like, Barbara?" asked Susan, eager for any kind of gossip. "Busy," she said. "So many people. All the women wear trousers too. There are stalls selling all kinds of things, but it's expensive, and some people are just there to fight." She must have seen the concern on Ian's face. "Griffiths looked after me." "I'll cook something up," said Susan. No one was going to protest, and they let her bustle about. Griffiths and Barbara sat down by the fire, not having to say a word to express how good that felt. After a moment, Griffiths produced something from his inside pocket, a slim newspaper folded lengthways. He opened the battered pages out and handed them over to the doctor. "We've a date for you," he said. The doctor squinted to read the blocky print. "The 15th of October," he said, "and 1972. I told you I'd get my sums right." "They have newspapers?" Ian asked, "when they're living in such squalor?" "They've all sorts of them," Barbara replied. "The man at the market said this was the one with the best news today, but there were plenty to choose from. There must be 20 or 30 different titles." "The press grew up once the machine was beaten," Griffiths explained. "There's no other source of news, no other authority. There's still loads of different papers in my time. "And very politicised too," said the doctor, scanning quickly over each page in turn. "Full of stories about terrible conditions in the city. They don't seem to have any food there. Inflation is rife, and the government, there is a government, are doing nothing about it." He offered the paper to Ian. "So it says here, anyway." "I wouldn't believe everything you read," advised Griffiths. "There were stories about cannibals in the city for years. Never any evidence found." "It makes for a good story," said the doctor. "Still," said Ian, glancing over the desperate, angry newsprint, "it's not going to be easy for us getting to Whitehall." "We should take it easy until Bamford gets here," said Barbara. "Recover our strength before we make the journey into town." "That's astute," said the doctor. "What are your thoughts, Mr. Griffiths?" "I agree," he said. "We've already run into trouble with the natives. Nothing I couldn't handle, Ian, don't worry. Keeping our heads down for the next day and a bit should see us through fine. How's the food coming along, Susan?" The girl's ears burnt pink as she looked up at them. "I think it's okay," she said. "It smells intriguing," said Ian, not sure what else to say. "After the hearty dinner, I suggest an early night. We could all do with that." Griffiths had taken charge of the group again, asserted himself over the doctor. It had been different back in the future in the test room. There, the doctor had been calling the shots. But Griffiths was a survivor. He knew how to exist in enemy territory. He knew how to get the job done. This was his turf. And yet, there was something about Griffiths that Ian didn't trust. Griffiths was unstintingly ruthless. A great ally he might be, but he wasn't someone you wanted to cross. "I'll take the first watch tonight," he said, keen to win what favours he could in advance, should he ever need to call them in. "Someone should stay on guard through the night." Despite his confident tone, his body railed against the idea. Sleep by the fire, such a welcome prospect. Griffiths's eyes narrowed. Had Ian been too bold, too obvious in his suspicions? The man licked his lips, bringing to mind a wolf about to strike. "Good man," was all he said, though. "I'll go next." 16th of October, 1972. They cleared away their makeshift breakfast. Griffiths had found where the other tenants got their water, a free-running supply from a broken pipe. Barbara and Susan rinsed the crockery, Ian standing guard. He didn't look as if he'd slept much. There was something haunted about him. Barbara felt stiff from a night on the floor, but better for the sleep and some food. The gruel was plain, tasting of plastic, yet it felt good just to eat something. Susan seemed especially invigorated. She nattered away about where she'd like to explore first, knowing she'd need to win over Barbara and Ian before taking the matter up with her grandfather. She wasn't content to sit all day listening to Griffiths and the doctor tell stories. "I thought we could look at where the lab is going to be," she said. "You'd like that, wouldn't you, Ian? You'd come with me, I mean." "We'll have to see, Susan." Other people were less fastidious about clearing up after themselves. There was litter all over the floor, meagre scraps from the meagre meals the other tenants had to keep them going. Rats scurried about, and insects, helping themselves to the leftovers. Barbara kept finding her gaze drawn to an old man down the hall, streaking his bushy moustache with leftover fat, greasing it out into great handlebars. Like the man who had attacked her yesterday, the old man still wore a ragged, dirty lab coat. He might have been in his 50s or 60s, but Barbara still recognized him. He was Andrews, another, older Andrews, who wouldn't know them, whose dignity and poise had slowly been leached away by the paltry existence he eked out here. A shiver ran right through her body. If they didn't discover the TARDIS, how long before they were reduced to the same state? If they had listened to Griffiths, they would have remained in their room all day, keeping well out of sight of the natives, keeping themselves to themselves. He had not liked the market one bit. It posed too many variables for him to negotiate, for him to be sure of anything. With no hope of fathoming the myriad loyalties and connections of the people jostling there, it might have been a mistake to ask so many questions, or to show how much money they had. He couldn't shake the thought that he and Barbara had been followed back to the quayside, a gang of surly privateers now waiting for an opportune moment to waylay the strangers. They were vulnerable, vagabonds in time. They shouldn't compromise themselves. By the afternoon, however, the doctor could resist Susan's pleading no longer. Griffiths protested, but the doctor brushed him off. Perhaps stretching their legs would be good for them, he said. Having received the doctor's consent, Ian offered to escort Susan so she wouldn't get into trouble, and she promised to stay with him at all times. He asked Barbara if she wanted to join them, and Griffiths saw how relieved the man was when she agreed straight away. Griffiths preferred to remain behind. "Bamford might be early," he said, "or we might lose our nest." The doctor stayed with him. They watched through the hole in the wall as Susan dashed round the side of the marina, continually glancing back to make sure Ian and Barbara were not too far behind. The girls' merry yelps and giggles echoed out across the water. All eyes were probably on her, and Griffiths could only grit his teeth. "You need not worry," said the doctor beside him, as if he had read his thoughts. "I watched a man in a lab coat materialize this morning. He was taken in by a group in that house over there. We're part of a community now, all misfits in this time. Nobody wishes us harm." "I'd like to hope so, Doctor, but my experience—" Yes. But you like Susan, though?" Griffiths was not sure how to answer that. Was the doctor sounding him out as a prospective match for the girl? It hardly seemed likely or desirable. She was so immature. "She needs to grow up a bit," he replied guardedly. What had the doctor expected him to say? This was hardly an appropriate juncture. They stood in silence, watching Susan and the others wander farther away. Finally, they were lost beyond warehouses and rubble. Griffiths could still just make out Susan's voice. "You'll forgive me," said the old man, dabbing at his brow with a handkerchief. "I simply worry about her future. I won't always be here to look out for her." "You've your other friends. Ian and Barbara are very good with her." The doctor turned to him, fixing Griffiths with a terrifying stare. "I'll be plain with you, Mr. Griffiths. Barbara told me what you did yesterday to protect her. I hope you understand. I could hope for little more for my Susan, especially should anything happen to me." "You're expecting trouble?" The doctor furrowed his brow. "No," he said. Griffiths nodded. He could understand that. He thought of his own daughter, of the tiny, hard bead of feeling he still had for her, hidden away deep inside himself. McSolacy would never be born now, not if he was successful in his mission here. He had sacrificed her to the greater good, the moral imperative. She had been a brilliant, bright-eyed girl, and all he could think was that if, somehow, there'd been a way to speak to her, to explain what he had the chance to make different. Her name meant one who forgives, a name for a new age, for a reconciled world. He'd taught her about their responsibilities to others. She would have understood. "I'll take care of her," said Griffiths. "Should anything happen to you, I'll take care of her." Ian and Barbara walked hand in hand. She couldn't remember them ever having done that before. Perhaps it was the late autumn sunshine, or the fact they still had a day left ahead of them with nothing required to be done. They had leisure time, their first pause in what seemed far too long. Or perhaps it was something else. "We're different, aren't we?" she said. "This has changed us." She meant that they had become closer, but her words had a terrible effect on Ian, stopping him right in his tracks. She took his other hand in hers, and it looked like he was struggling to find the right words. He looked older, she thought, worn thin by their last 24 hours. Yet he remained resilient, still fighting, ever the gentleman. Her heart went out to him. "Barbara," he said, "the man who died, the man like me, you're the original," Barbara told him. "I realize that now." "He was different," he went on, agonized by this. "I couldn't sleep last night, no matter how tired I was. I couldn't get him out of my head. You see, he killed a man. I watched him, I watched me, and I murdered a man. I did that." "What are you saying, Ian? You're not a monster." He screwed his face up, and for a moment she thought he might weep. Instead, he chuckled a high-pitched and maddened sound. She had no idea what to do with him. She let go of him and took a step backwards. Ian stood where he was, head bowed, staring at his empty hands. "He was married," he said. "I took his wedding ring from him." "Yes, I know," said Barbara. "I saw you with it. He was different, Ian, from a different branch from you and I." "No," said Ian, looking up at her. "We're the same man, capable of the same things. I've looked at the ring. It's worn and old, Barbara. He'd been married to you years ago." Her heart hammered in her chest. "Me?" she said. "He wasn't married to me, not me standing here. Like you said, they did things differently. Please, Ian, you're not making any sense." "No," said Ian. He reached for her hands again. She let him take them. "Barbara," he said, "will you—" A scream pierced the quiet afternoon. Susan's scream. Ian let Barbara's hands drop, staring all round. "It came from up this way," he said, instantly the man of action. "Come on." They raced down the street, Barbara lagging behind Ian's quick strides. Catching sight of something as he passed, Ian skidded round a corner, bashing his arm on the wall. Barbara followed, in time to see a wiry old devil scurrying out of sight. His head was shaved, but his bushy beard was snow-white. His frantic bow-legged run made him look like a pantomime villain. Ian ignored the man, racing to Susan, curled into a ball on the pavement. "Susan!" he said, and she sprang at him, wrapping her arms tight around his body. When Barbara caught up with them, Susan came to her. "He asked my name," she wailed, "and then he grabbed me. He said... "It's all right, Susan," Barbara told her, cradling her as she wept. She looked up at Ian, his own worries forgotten in his concern for the girl. Their eyes met over the top of Susan's head. "It's all right. I shouldn't have run off," she said. "No," Ian said. "I think we'll stay indoors from now on." 17th October, 1972. Ian and Griffiths must have stayed up all night. When Barbara awoke a little after 6, they were comparing notes on pubs they both knew, the characters of the locals unchanging, despite being 40 years apart. It was like they were testing each other. Their voices were quiet, hoarse from all the hours, and barely discernible over the crackle and spit of the fire. The men never once moved their heads. Both had their eyes fixed on the spot by the quay where they themselves had materialized. "Morning," said Ian, not looking back at her. "Good morning," she said, trying to sound bright and cheerful for his sake, to show she appreciated being left to sleep. He didn't respond. She could tell he had not been able to sleep again, still haunted by the actions of his other self. Seeing yourself die, she thought, that must be terrible. She would just have to leave him be, give him time to sort it all out in his head. He and Griffiths were silent now, as if she'd intruded on their watch, ruined the intimacy they'd built up. She needed to find something to do. Barbara rummaged in the food bag, knowing the men would be grateful for breakfast. Unable to clean her teeth, she wanted some food herself to overpower the furry, sleepy taste in her mouth. What she wouldn't have done for a full English, the kind she used to love cooking at weekends for Mum. She would have to make do. they only had a couple of tins of the featureless gruel and a final packet of dried biscuits. It was hardly enough for all 5 of them. As she opened the tins, Barbara wondered how much money they had left to buy more. Bamford would arrive soon, and they had nothing to feed her. The gruel slopped easily into the frying pan. Barbara balanced the pan on some coal-like embers. "Anything?" she asked. "Nothing yet," said Ian. She stirred the gruel, knowing she was making no difference. It would take a good while for the food to heat through. When she looked up again, Ian was watching her. His eyes were sunken, exhausted, and he desperately needed a shave. Barbara had always admired him for being immaculate. It had only been a couple of days for them since the TARDIS had brought them to the Isle of Dogs, and already they were haggard and broken, pale imitations of their former selves. The food took an age. Barbara stirred it with the wooden spoon, staring into the endlessly changing swirl of patterns she cut into it, lost in melancholic thoughts she couldn't recall afterwards. Eventually, the gruel burped and bubbled. The plastic odour had filled their room, and Susan and the doctor were sitting up, watching her. Susan looked pale. She hadn't spoken since they'd brought her back inside last night. She had simply huddled with her grandfather. "Give me a hand," Barbara asked. The girl didn't seem to hear. After a moment, as if having considered it, she scowled in protest and extracted herself from her tangled blankets to come over. She spread their plates out, tore open the packet of biscuits, placing 2 oat slabs neatly on each. "Smells wonderful," she said, sticking her head right over the pan to inhale. Putting a brave face on, Barbara could tell. The giddy, flitting persona was an act. Barbara was rather impressed. "It's the best we can do," she chided, prodding Susan out of the way with her elbow to spoon gruel onto each of the plates. It looked like macaroni cheese, she thought, only without the pasta. Susan gathered up 2 of the plates and hurried them over to Griffiths and Ian. The men took the food without thanking her. Susan lingered around them, willing them to notice she was there. They didn't look round, too busy watching the key. After the long night, they'd be determined not to lose sight of Bamford now. Susan was nearly in tears. "Come and eat," Barbara told her. Bamford had still not arrived by the time they had finished their meal. Barbara and Susan took the dishes downstairs to the pump, taking their time washing up because it was all they had to keep them occupied. "Do you like Griffiths?" asked Susan, trying to make it sound casual. "He's a very able man, Susan. But he's tough, too, like a diamond." "Yes," replied Susan gleefully. "He is like a diamond. He's strong like that." Barbara saw her bite her lip, realizing she had said too much. "Don't get too carried away with him," Barbara warned. "His mission will come first, you know." Susan lowered her face. "Or perhaps you like him yourself," she said. "Susan!" Barbara cleared her throat, aware how shrill her surprise had been. "I don't think of him like that. He's been good to us, that's all." Susan seemed to take that on board. She carried on scrubbing at the frying pan furiously. "Anyway," she said without looking up, "you've got Ian." "Yes," said Barbara. "I've got Ian." "I was thinking," began Susan, but she didn't get any further. They both turned at the commotion. Griffiths and Ian were racing each other down the corridor. "You think she's arrived?" asked Susan, grinning. "When you're finished here, we can go and see." The woman on the quayside was no more than 30, younger than either of the men. She was startled when they tumbled out of the warehouse, breathless and waving madly, but she stood her ground. Slim, lithe, her hair cropped short in the military style, she looked like she could handle herself. Her eyes were wide, though, and Ian realized she was still reeling from the trip. She was tough, even at this age. "You're some kind of welcoming committee?" she said. "Yes," said Ian. Welcome to 1972, Colonel Bamford. She scratched at one ear. Something screwed up then, she said. Doesn't it always? Said Griffiths. You expected to pop out on the far side of the hoop? Kind of hoped to. And you guys are? Ian Chesterton, said Ian, extending his hand. He had a firm, business-like handshake. This is Griffiths. You know, I never learnt your first name. No, said Griffiths. You didn't. Bamford was grinning at them, her smile quite glorious. It didn't seem possible this was the same person. She nodded at something behind him. He'll be the boffin, I guess. Ian turned. The doctor had emerged from the house, strutting forward regally, a hand at his lapel. Ian knew the look on his face. He was such a charmer when it came to the ladies. You're very welcome, Miss Bamford, he said. I trust you know what's happened here? You screwed up, right? The doctor blinked at her. Me? No, he said sternly. I never screw up. I'm the one here to clean up the mess. Right-ho, said Bamford. You tell me what you want. Barbara and Susan joined them. Susan's jaw hung open, but she had not yet thought of anything to say. Surely she had known Bamford would be younger. Any more of you? Asked Bamford, once introductions had been made. And how long you been here? You all look a right state. Her smile was infectious. They were all lit up by it. You'll have to forgive our appearance, my dear, the doctor said. The experiment has produced some odd results. They stood on the quayside while the doctor told Bamford the version of events he'd prepared. She interrupted when he started to explain about the tree of choices, the myriad branches that existed in time. Know the theory, she said. Had to swat up before they'd let me on the team. Very well, said the doctor, flustered by her easy charm. The means to correct all this is in Whitehall, of course. Where the early work's being done. Gotcha. You want to get in there, borrow their stuff, and jump-start us back where we should be. That's right, Griffiths said quickly. That's exactly our plan. Bamford considered. Yeah, okay, she said, at length. I'm with you guys. It won't be easy, Ian told her. He explained what they knew of the city and its dangers. Bamford seemed fine with that, and even offered them her resources. She, too, had an envelope stuffed with different kinds of cash. We might as well be off, then, said the doctor, evidently baffled by how simple it had been. He couldn't keep his eyes off the woman, and not, thought Ian, because she was so easy on the eye. Griffiths ducked back into the warehouse to gather up what food they'd got, and they then headed west to join the river. Ian glanced at Bamford, shocked to find her grinning right back at him. 1972, eh? She said, like this was all some great adventure. You know, there's someone I wouldn't mind looking up.